Oh, hello there. One second, I have a letter right here for you. Oh, you don't need to see it. See, I was given these letters by King Artaxerxes himself in case I ran into any governors on my way back to Judah, so that way I could travel home safely. You might be wondering, how did I get a letter from King Artaxerxes, the king of Persia himself? Well, see, I am Nehemiah, and I'm cupbearer to the king. What's the king's cupbearer doing so far away from the king's palace in Susa? That's such a great question. I'm so glad you asked, and I'm excited to tell you all about it. Just a few months ago, I had no idea that I would be this far away from Susa. In fact, if you had told me that this is where I would be, I would have told you there's no way. It all started when my brother Hanani met me in Susa, joined by other men of Judah. I must confess, I found it a bit strange and alarming when I found out Hanani had come to see me. It had been years since I'd seen anyone from my family. Now you might be wondering, is something bad happen? And the answer to that is no, nothing is wrong at all. It's not even that I don't love my family. I love them very much. But to understand the reason why I hadn't seen them in so long, it will help to understand and hear the story of my people. My ancestors aren't from Susa. My family comes from Israel, specifically from Judah. That's right. We are the people of God, or as we call him, Adonai. Well before I was born, Israel, our people of Judah, were captured and brought into exile by Babylon. We were ripped away from our homeland. Adonai even warned us that this would happen because of our disobedience against him. Our history, as told by our scriptures, reveals just story after story of our rebellion against God, through our striving after gods of our own. Ironically, after we had been brought into exile, we were forced to live in a pagan land, forced to worship gods that weren't Adonai. We constantly had done what was right in our own eyes. Israel was supposed to be God's people, yet we were living like we were foreigners. Eventually, Babylon was conquered by Persia, and after that, King Cyrus of Persia allowed some to return from exile, but many still remained here. A little over a decade ago, Ezra the priest and anybody who wanted to go with him were allowed to return to Jerusalem. And though many Israelites had turned to foreign gods, there were still many who worshipped Adonai. My father, Hakaliah, had raised our family to worship and honor Adonai, the one true God. This had been the case for my family for many generations in exile. See, our entire family had been born in exile. This was how we had learned the scriptures. We had heard story after story about God's faithfulness to his people, about how he had brought us from the land of Egypt and placed us into a land of our own. We had heard stories growing up, my brother and I had, about how our ancestors worshipped God in the beautiful and towering temple built by King Solomon. The temple was destroyed because of Babylon's siege of Jerusalem, but it was rebuilt by Zerubbabel when Cyrus allowed the first exiles to return. Worshipping God here in Persia is fine, there's nothing wrong with it, but we had always longed to walk into the house of God, to see the ornate beauty of gold, silver, and fine wood that just lined the temple. When Ezra was leaving to return to Jerusalem, and any Israelite could go with him, I told my family they had to go. This was something we had always dreamed of, something we had longed to do, to worship God in the temple. I was already appointed cupbearer to the king, so returning home was going to prove challenging for me. We all wanted to go, but I couldn't. And with my parents growing old, I couldn't bear to keep them from worshiping Adonai in the temple like they had dreamed. Every one of them went back, and I thought this was going to be the last time I'd ever seen them. That is until Hanani had come back to see me. It was good to see him, but as I said, I was nervous. Had something gone wrong? Were my parents okay? What about the rest of our people in Jerusalem? As Hananiah approached, he had this expression on his face like he had been through something far worse than exile, and it appeared that my fears were coming true. As he approached, he said, "We need to talk, brother." I asked him if everything was okay in Jerusalem. How are mother and father doing? What about our people there? He told me that everyone is alive and in good health, but there is great trouble and shame. The wall of Jerusalem is broken and the gates have been destroyed. Immediately I knew why Hananiah had come. He knew my position, cupbearer to King Artaxerxes. It's a noble position, prestige. I'm in the king's presence every day. In fact, I have access to the king when he is relaxing and off the job. Not many have this kind of access to the king. They don't have this kind of relationship with him. Of course, Hananiah knew this, and he was here to convince me to leverage my position for the good of our people, for the good of Adonai's people. Jerusalem was in ruin. The walls were broken. The gates had been destroyed. It was complete and total political disarray that affected our ability to worship Adonai in safety. Israel was currently the laughing stock among its surrounding nations. Anyone that wanted to do harm to our people could. In fact, it was probably only a matter of time before someone tried something like this. My brother knew I was in a position to do something about it. I was in a position of political prestige, closer to King Artaxerxes than any of our people. I could do something about this. But my job wasn't to tell the king what to do. My job was to serve him, not ask him to serve me. What would the king say? Could I lose this prestigious position? Could I even lose my life for trying to tell King Artaxerxes what to do? I was deeply saddened by this news, but it wasn't right for me to be sad in the king's presence. Would it be even worth it to bring it to his attention? First, I didn't really know what to do. I was in the best position to do something, but everything within me told me that my circumstances would be better if I did nothing. Yet it was clear that Adonai had placed me in this unique position, so I did the only thing I knew I could do. I mourned and cried out for days. I cried out to Adonai. For days I didn't even eat anything, but only cried out to him. My desperation drove me to my knees in prayer. I begged Adonai to listen to me, not because of who I am, not because of who our people are, but because of who he is. I confessed to him my sin. I confessed to him the sins of our people. I knew my desire to do nothing was acting out of fear, and ultimately it was sinful. I also knew that sin was the reason for our exile. Our people had constantly done what we wanted to do instead of obeying the commands of Adonai. We had brought this ruin on ourselves, just as Adonai had warned us. And as a result, I knew there was nothing I could do to bargain with God. There was nothing I could do to say, Look how faithful I'm being. Listen to me. Do what I'm asking, God. I couldn't even bargain with him in that way. I had no power to do that. I struggled with sin. Our people struggled with sin. And I was asking him to do something about this very trouble and shame of our people in Jerusalem that was brought on by this very sin. I wanted Adonai to forgive us and have mercy on his people. I asked Adonai to remember what he had promised to Moses in the Torah, that if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the peoples. But if you return to me and keep my commandments and do them, though your outcasts are in the uttermost parts of heaven, from there I will gather them and bring them to the place that I have chosen, to make my name dwell there. Adonai had said that unfaithfulness would lead to our exile, and it had. But if we returned to him, he would allow us to return from that exile. I felt like I was praying for these things constantly. As I said, my position as cupbearer put me in the king's presence daily. I continued to see him every day over the course of months, even as I was praying these very things. I guess I forgot to explain exactly what it is that I do I deliver King Artaxerxes his wine. Every day I come in and do my job with a smile on my face, talk with the king about how he's doing, and then eventually I would leave. I kept asking God, is there something I can do? If so, what does that even look like? Perhaps you're wondering how my position is even prestigious. See, I don't just bring the king his wine. I also taste it. I don't mean to brag, but I'm good at my job. The king trusts me, and I'm not sure I'd even be alive if he didn't. See, my position requires me to test the king's wine before he drinks it in order to make sure that it's not poisoned. My position is prestigious because I hold the king's trust. He kind of has to, or else he could die. I'm literally volunteering to die so that he can be assured of his safety. I was thinking about my position quite a bit as I cried out to Adonai in prayer. One day, just after I had finished my duties with the king, Adonai reminded me of the words of the prophet Isaiah. My father, Hakaliah, had taught them to me growing up and told me that our people had clung to them as they suffered in exile. I continued to hold on to them in times of trial to this day. Isaiah speaks of a suffering servant, indeed a man of sorrows who is acquainted with grief. He understands suffering. He carries our sorrow and bears our grief. In fact, Isaiah even says that he was pierced and crushed for our sin, and by his wounds we are healed. The prophet literally says that his chastisement will bring us peace. I'm not exactly sure what these events will look like, but his suffering will bring his people safety. All of a sudden, I realized that this kind of feels like my position with the king, as cupbearer to the king. Granted, just not to as great of an extent. See, I take on the potential suffering of King Artaxerxes so that he will remain safe. After this realization, my prayer that day changed. It's not that I didn't confess my sin or the sins of our people. I continued to do that. I also continued to petition God to be faithful to what he had promised. However, I realized that just as this man of sorrows is a servant of Adonai, I too am Adonai's servant as cupbearer to the king. And so I prayed, Lord, listen to your servant and to your servants who fear you, and grant me mercy as I come before the king. I was filled with peace, knowing that these things were ultimately based on what Adonai has promised. I believed Adonai would be faithful to his promises, regardless of what happened. And so I prepared for myself for what was about to happen. That night felt like the longest night of my life. I constantly tossed and turned, but I didn't sleep. I had no idea what was going to happen, but I was convinced that this was going to be the last day of my life. I was scared about what was going to happen, but I knew that Adonai would be with me, and this is what comforted me. Since I couldn't sleep, I just started praying. I asked for courage and for Adonai to remember his promises. I thought and was convinced, like I said, that this would be the last day of my life. I got up and got ready for my job as cupbearer that day, and I was nervous the entire time. Thoughts just constantly were racing through my head about what might happen. My heart was beating fast. Sure, there were occasional moments of peace, but I had no idea what was going to happen. All of a sudden, I had heard that King Artaxerxes was ready for his wine, and that the queen was with him. And when I heard this, I knew this was Adonai's appointed time. See, the queen isn't allowed at public banquets, so my audience was the king and his queen, nobody else. It was just going to be me, the king, and the queen. This was indeed my opportunity. Rather than putting on my normal, smiling, happy face, I let my sadness be seen. As I passed down the corridor that led to the king's quarters, my heart started racing faster and faster and faster and faster. I was wondering, would I lose the king's trust? Was I walking to my impending doom? I'd never been sad in the king's presence before, but this ran laps around my head. As I reached the king's door, I knocked. As I said, I'd never been sad in the king's presence before, but now there was no way out. King Artaxerxes said, "Come in, Nehemiah." As I entered, he noticed the look on my face and said, "Nehemiah, why is your face sad?" I thought my heart was going to explode. Knowing my sadness might indicate to him that something was wrong with his wine, I'm sure that King Artaxerxes was greatly distressed. In fact, I could see it on his face. King Artaxerxes asked what had happened, and so I had said, "Let the king live forever. Why shouldn't my face be sad? Jerusalem, the place of my ancestors, is in ruin. The walls and gates have been destroyed, and my people live in humiliation and fear danger." King Artaxerxes replied, "What are you requesting?" This was it. Here was my opportunity that Adonai had prepared for me as his servant. Before answering the king, I prayed silently for Adonai for wisdom. It was a quick prayer, and then I spoke up. I said, "If it pleases the king, let me return home to Jerusalem to rebuild the wall." As I asked the question, I watched the distress turn to calm on the king's face. He no longer worried about the status of his wine, and I could tell that he trusted me. I knew King Artaxerxes was going to let me go before he actually said it, and he did. He let me return to rebuild the wall so my people could worship Adonai in safety. We set up how long I would be gone, and he even provided me with the letters that I showed you for safe passages and all the materials I need to build the wall. This is what brings me so far away from Susa. The king has sent me, his royal cupbearer, to rebuild the wall in Jerusalem. Once rebuilt, our people will not have to worry about impending suffering because the walls would protect them. They would worship him in peace and safety. I still can't believe it. I thought for sure that I was going to die, that I was going to lose my life. Clearly, Adonai had put me in this position for a reason. I couldn't have accomplished this on my own. This had to be the work of Adonai. His good hand was upon me, his servant, Nehemiah. I can't imagine how any of this would have been possible without Adonai. He was the one who had led me to pray for months. He was the one who gave me the appointed opportunity to make this bold request of King Artaxerxes. In fact, none of this would have even been possible had he not placed me in this position, this prestigious role as cupbearer to the king. This was Adonai's plan from the start. This is why he hadn't allowed for me to return from exile with the rest of my family, so that I could be in this position to help our people rebuild the walls. He simply allowed me, his servant Nehemiah, to be used by him. Remember that man the prophet Isaiah spoke of? That suffering servant and man of sorrows? Supposedly we will be healed by his wounds. Do you think there will be one day a man of sorrows who will bring peace to sinners? I wonder if he will bring healing to those who suffer. If he does, I hope you have a chance to meet him. Well, as you can imagine, I must be on my way. I have lots to do in Jerusalem. Thank you so much for listening to my story.